workshop because it's a place that I can come and be myself and express myself and create. This is my church. This is where I get satisfaction as a human being, be creative and feel this incredible connection to this timber and to these instruments and think, I'm very lucky. Well, my earliest memories were around about 1970. So you're looking at sort of 5 years old. I don't recall a time when there hasn't been a guitar in the house. So my first guitar teacher was Steve Biddulph, who was like an older brother to me. And so he turned me on to, he gave me my first lessons, but he turned me on to things like Cat Stevens, blues music, and that was a big influence because that fired my imagination. As your interest and appreciation grows, you listen more widely. My big aha moment was hearing the Rolling Stones on 3XY. That was the introduction to rock and roll, proper rock and roll that really hit home and rung true. Things evolve and my interest in guitar building evolved, and I think the interest that I had in antique furniture and old timber and old finishes began to be something that I wanted to incorporate into my guitar building. It wasn't so much a matter of wanting to make something unique to me, although I think that's ultimately what's happened. It was more that I had strong interest in the old aspects of the polishing trade, the old finishes, using the hand skills rather than CNC technology, which is cheap as chips now. Wanting to use old timber, and the old veneers, makes better instruments ultimately, because particularly the stuff from the pianos that I use, it was A-grade musical instrument timber in its day. It's gone on over the decades to get better and better and better. A lot of the timber we use in the guitars we make is very, very old, and it's either from an old building, like this piece of Oregon, or the old antique pianos that we get in, where we salvage as much of the old timber and veneer as we can. Either way, the old timber just has a resonance all of its own, which really contributes to the tone of the guitars. Obviously, this is rough sawn, so we have to process it to get it down to usable size. We'll put it through the thicknesser and dimension it down to where we want it to be, and then give it a rough sand through the drum sander, and then take it back to the other workshop where we join it up and make a body blank out of it, which is what will happen in this case. But very, very old. This particular piece out of a house which is about 120 years old. Often come with nails, so we have to de-nail them, but very, very seasoned and very light and very dry, so perfect for musical instruments. I can really hear that that's a great piece of timber for what we want to do with it. It's just got a nice ring to it. It's a nice weight, and certainly most of the timber we deal with, even when you're just moving it around in its rough sawn state, you can just hear that it's going to make a great guitar. I love old pianos, and I think it's a tragedy that a lot of them end up at the tip when they've passed their useful working life as an instrument. Often it's because the soundboard's split and they can't be tuned, or they're just not wanted anymore. The timber in these was A-grade, a musical instrument timber when the instruments were new, and the veneers you can't buy anymore. So to be able to take an old piano and repurpose it and turn it into guitars, in my case, and not just the body, but the neck, utilise the veneers, pays homage to the instruments, the old craftsmen that made those instruments, the history of the piano, and repurposes it and rebirths it into a musical instrument with that's already got a history. So this is what's left of a piano. We've used of a panel rather. We've used the veneer feature panel out of this frame. We try and use as much of the piano as we can. I reckon about 90% of the piano we use, including the soundboard. It's wonderful timber to work with. The veneers are beautiful. The resonance of this timber is unsurpassed, and you can hear that in the guitars that are ultimately made from these instruments. They just resonate loudly and beautifully. And people who know about these things can tell straight away when they start playing those guitars that are made from the old pianos. Well, it really started when I went to Sturt in 1996. Sturt Galleries is a multidisciplinary craft centre located in Bowral, which is probably realistically Australia's premier craft institution. I guess the early days of mucking around with guitars and wood, and then ultimately antiques, old furniture, doing up old furniture, that kind of made my transition into Sturt something that I wanted to do. Tom was this incredible character he was a very sensitive man, but he was a wonderful, wonderful educator and technically very brilliant. Never ceases to amaze me how he got a class of novice woodworkers and in the space of 12 months educated and trained them to be first-class tradespeople in their own right, who in some cases then embarked on becoming designer makers in their own right. Quite an extraordinary feat. He was a very kind man, and I was very, very lucky to have studied under him. Sometimes when I get stuck with something, I just leave it and the answer comes to me, and I think that's Tom. It's come from Tom. He's passed now, and I feel, I'd like him to be here. So the first instrument I made was a Strat knockoff, and I've still got it. And when I look back now, I'm surprised at how well it turned out, which in a sense the woodworking and the polishing bit, that shouldn't be a surprise, but it's all the subtle nuances of making a guitar that were new to me, which turned out really well as well. What's different about the instruments I make is that they're made from old antique timber sourced from 100+ year old pianos or old heritage buildings. In the case of pianos, it's been used as a musical instrument all its life, or in the case of timber from old buildings, it's been sitting in a wall or sitting as a beam somewhere. They're so dry, and in the case of the piano stuff is subject to vibrations whilst it's being played. It just makes for a better guitar because of the acoustic quality. The changes in the timbre and means that it just vibrates better and produces a better sound. So the timbers are carefully selected and processed and made into guitar bodies and necks. The way I manufacture the instruments, or the way I build the instruments, using the way I was taught at Sturt, which is the old-fashioned, old-school way, hand skills. Obviously, we use a router and a bandsaw and things like that. But generally, the finishing things like shaping the neck, all done by hand. Sanding, all done by hand. And then the French polishing aspect is they'll often be finished in the old school French polishing ways. So French polish, shellac, sometimes lacquer, old school nitrocellulose lacquer. Sometimes I pull that up by hand with a rubber, they're all things that are starting to be lost now. So for me, it's a way of using some of the old trade methods, keeping them alive, because they're disappearing now. People don't do this work anymore. French polishing just doesn't get done commercially anymore. It's not just that it's old timber, but it's preserving the old way of making things as well. So I really like unusual and bespoke hardware. So I often source out guys that make bridges and pickups when I buy pickups, the old way. So, which complements my philosophy on the way I make things. All the electrical components are the best quality. There's no cutting any corners there, because ultimately that adds up to, complements the quality of the timbre of the instrument. A while back I started making pickups for myself, and I just found that that's a way of me fine-tuning the ultimate end sound of the instrument. So what I do really complements everything else that I've done by hand. Slightly different voicing, slightly different pickup because it's made by me, and I reckon they sound great. So the inspiration for how I use the timber, like what sort of model that I make, often comes from what I see in the veneer or the solid timber. So if it's got a particular grain pattern or a particular feature that is really outstanding, I'll often think about how I can best use that and what shape highlights that veneer or that grain pattern. And they look great. So if you're buying a guitar, hopefully you're buying one of mine, it's how it feels, how it plays, and then how it looks. Also, with my instruments, you're not just buying the guitar, you're buying the story, because every instrument has a story. Whether they've been an old piano and they've had years and years and years of being played as a piano, or whether they've come from an old historic building, there's a story there, and that story adds to the appeal of the instrument. People that have picked up my instruments who can really play, and even people who are just amateur musicians, they can feel the difference between each individual instrument. Each instrument has its own characteristics, has its own sound, and has its own feel. That adds to the uniqueness of each instrument. It's almost like the instruments have their own soul.